Okay, so what is a performing arts? What would it be to call something an artistic performance? Well, let's think of paradigm examples, things like a symphony or some dance or some theatre play. We should ask ourselves what allows us to say they're artistic. Um, and it looks like there's going to be two options initially for thinking of these as artistic. One is the some artwork, what Davies called the performed work, which is being realized, which is being manifest in the instances of those performances. So, for example, the symphony is artistic because it's a performance of a artistic thing, a score. The performance of Hamlet is artistic because it's a manifestation of some artwork, which is the script. So you've got something which we can call the performed work, and the way that the work performance is artistic is because they somehow let us appreciate those performed works. The second way would be to say that actually the performance itself is what's artistic. So in this instance, whatever counts as a work of art is such that the performance itself could count as such. And this is what Davies calls the performance work. They look like the two options we'd have to try and work out if we were to think of teaching as an artistic performance. Okay, so how might we understand teaching as artistic performance in the first way? Well, there are at least three questions we'd need to think through if we were taking this route. The first one is, what is the equivalent to the performed work in teaching case? So in the music case, you've got a score. In the dance, you've got sort of choreography. In the theatre case, a play, you've got the script, whatever. What would be the equivalent in the teaching case? What would be the art work that would be somehow appreciated via the performance? Interesting question. You might think of it as the lecture itself. There might be some kind of thing that we call a lecture. We might think of it as a lesson plan or something. Some writers have talked about it as idealized versions of ourselves somehow that's being performed. All these are really interesting and need thinking through. But also on the back of that, you have a question of what the ontological status of the performed work is in the case of the teaching. So you might think there's some kind of type, the performed work is a type, a lecture or whatever, and there's different tokens of that in the performances. There's questions about authenticity here, about repeatability. So with a score, you can repeat that. Well, how does that relate to teaching? And there's also a question about how the work performance, if I'm giving a lecture on a Tuesday, and that's meant to be artistic because it's somehow a performance of something, a performed work, a lecture, say, then what's that relationship between those two things? So again, lots of questions here, but these are things we need to deal with if we want to take the first option, whereby teaching is artistic performance because it gives light to, allows us to appreciate some kind of performed work. What is a performed work? What's its status? How do we come to know it? What's the relationship between that and the performance itself? Okay, what about the second option? Maybe we think this idea of somehow a lecture that somehow manifests through lectures, or a lesson plan that's artistic that somehow manifests through lessons. That's a bit weird. So maybe we want to think of the lecture itself or the class itself being artistic, not because it's somehow highlighting or let us appreciating some artwork, but because it just is in itself artistic. And the paradigm example would be something like jazz improvisation, as I mentioned before. Here's a case where there just isn't any artwork that's being somehow realized, because there is no score, there's no musical score, it's improvisation after all. And if we want to call that performing arts, jazz improvisation, then maybe we can run a similar lines with teaching. So the question there is, like, could teaching be an artistic vehicle that articulates particular artistic content itself? That's an interesting question. I'd be interested to know what people think. In the jazz case, what allows us to say that's sort of artistic are things like spontaneity, reading the room, working within certain known parameters, scales, etc. Maybe we can run a parallel in the teaching case. It's an open question at least. Maybe there is something that would allow us to take it in that way. Maybe typically we don't think of it in that way, but maybe there is some way of doing this. We'd have to just think about seriously what that artistic content would be. If it's not inheriting its sort of artisticness from the score or the choreography or a lecture, in our case, then what allows us to talk about it having artistic value? Okay, maybe though there is another option which was not presented initially because it's sort of slightly outside how we normally think of these things. And there's a category here of performance art, and that's the difference between artistic performance. It's a very distinct category, and it's a bit like conceptual art. So maybe we are best trying to understand teaching as artistic performance thought of as performance art. Of course, that raises questions about how we demarcate performance art and what gives it aesthetic value. I mean, think of some examples of performance art, things like following piece, where there's instructions that you follow in New York, follow a random person around, noting what they do, not going into any private residence or anything, but just that's what you do. When it's performed, there's no audience, and if in galleries, there's just a few pictures of various things on that event. Or a meter by meter column of air going up infinitely. The point here, of course, is not the thing itself, but the mental engagement with the ideas. The performance is on the audience themselves, going through, thinking about those things, engaging with those things. So maybe if those things are artistic, if that column of air going up infinitely, if you think of that piece, that instruction as a form of performance art, conceptual art, and we take that to be artistic because it's to do with how we as an audience engage and what we do with the ideas, maybe that's a way of us thinking of teaching as an artistic performance. So the idea would be that the students somehow perform the ideas in certain ways, such that we're allowed to say that the teaching itself is a form of performance art. Lots of things here trying to get this off the ground, but that would be a way of understanding what it might be to talk about teaching as artistic performance. This is what Davey says about performance art. It seems that the artistic content is articulated by the idea of carrying out such a performance. So perhaps the idea of carrying out what is presented in the lecture or the class is itself what gives it the sort of artistic content. Again, very speculative, lots of ideas here, but that would be another option.